Hey guys, it's Timothy here looking at the green cards from Amonkhet. I know in the last video I technically mentioned we'd be looking at red cards next, but kind of got sidetracked and put together a video for the green cards first. So we'll talk about red in the next video. Green's looking pretty sweet here. It's a little bit interesting since this set is based around -1/-1 counters as a form of pumping and removal instead of +1/+1 counters, which we're normally used to. We're going to see a lot of creatures that take advantage of that. So in a normal set, you'll have small creatures that get bigger. In this set, you have big creatures that start off a little bit smaller and then remove -1/-1 counters to build them up instead of putting +1/+1 counters to get bigger. But you'll see what we mean here. Same kind of thing we mentioned when we looked at some of the black cards, but it's more prevalent in green. Anyway, let's go and kick things off. If, again, as always, you are interested in the rating scale that I use, it is on screen right now. 10s being the highest possible value, the strongest cards in the set. 9s being pretty close to them, and then all the way down to our 0s, which I like to get out of the way first. These are the cards you're disappointed to see in your draft set. The card that you're just never first picking, always wheels, and you're sad to see it again. And I have mentioned a couple unplayable cards in this review so far, and we are going to mention another one for green. It might be a little bit contentious with some people, but I really don't see the value of the card. That card is a rare, of course. Harvest Season, 2 and a green for a sorcery, and you get to search for a number of lands and put them on the battlefield tapped equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. So this seems like it has the potential to be very, very good. Like, this can potentially grab 3-4+ lands out of your deck at one time, but only in very specific circumstances. You have to have a bunch of tapped creatures, which is a little awkward to set up, especially in green, because green needs to already have creatures on the board, meaning you already have mana, meaning you've already played out a good portion of your hand. You need to have good attacks, because this being a sorcery means that you have to get those creatures tapped somehow, and the most likely way you're going to do that is with them attacking, and they still need to be alive afterwards in order for you to get any sort of bonus. Plus, if you're only getting one basic land off of this, it's not even that good of a card, since there's a split card that does the same exact thing for the same mana cost. I guess if you get 2 lands off of this and you didn't struggle for it, it goes to a little bit of a weak card to a pretty decent card, but that's asking a lot, right? You have to have a decent number of creatures at a point where you would actually still want to even cast Harvest Season. By the time you get to the late game and you have enough creatures to attack and get a bunch of lands, you probably already have all the land drops you want. So I'm really not seeing the value in this card. I guess there's something to be set up with Exert and creatures not untapping during the next turn. But I'm just not seeing this card as a very playable one at all. And if you see something that I don't, let me know, because I just don't see it in this card. Sideboard cards. Remember that sideboard cards with Cycling are ones that you could perfectly main deck without anybody giving you some grief about it. But I still like to keep them in the sideboard because there are matchups where they're just not going to be that great. The first one is Sting and Shot. 1 green mana for an instant that puts 3 -1/-1 counters on a target flying creature, or you can cycle it off for 2 generic mana. There are some really good flyers in this set. In fact, a lot of the 9s and 10s I've given out so far, aside from planeswalkers, are just big flying creatures. Being able to shrink them down, even if you can't kill them, is really nice, but I still like to advocate for putting flying-based removal in the sideboard and then bringing it up when you need it, as opposed to main decking it and hoping your opponent has it. Again, there's the failsafe of cycling, but the cycling cost is not 100% free, and I would rather just have a more versatile card in my deck when it comes to this slot. The same goes for Dissenter's Deliverance, 1 in a green to destroy an artifact, or you can cycle it for a single green mana. Much better cycling cost this time around, but a much less versatile effect. I mentioned this in the white video, I believe, and maybe a couple other videos, but there just aren't a lot of artifacts you would want to even sideboard this card in against. So if you're playing this card, you're really hoping to cycle it. And green also is not the color that has a lot of payoff for cycling, as opposed to something like blue or black. So I don't really see a huge payoff for putting Dissenter's Deliverance in the main board unless you're running really, really slim on main deckable cards, in which case your draft's probably not going that well. But I do like these cards coming out of the sideboard. I just think you leave them in the sideboard until we start seeing that main deck and cycling cards is the thing you should be doing in this format. From there, we're going to look at two cards that one of which I think is bad and one of which I actually think is just fantastic, but am going to be very strict on my rating scale. That card is Sandworm Convergence, which I've actually had a lot of talk with people about. Some people think it's stone cold unplayable. I think it's probably actually just a good card. Not a busted bomb by any means, but just a good win condition for a green deck. It's kind of awkward though. So you're paying 8 mana for an enchantment, and flyers can't attack you anymore, or your planeswalkers, and on your end step you get a 5/5 worm creature token. Now there are some decks that this is just going to shut down. If your opponent's the blue-white flyer deck, good game, you just won. And it is worth mentioning that there are very, very few ways to get rid of enchantments once they've hit the board in this format. So once this sticks, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be around for the rest of the game. Not to mention, you just get a 5/5 every single turn. And while this doesn't look like it has immediate value, it really does, because it triggers on the end step. So you're getting that 5/5 the turn you play this, and then an additional 5/5 every single turn after that. It is 8 mana though, but I'm going to be honest, I think you can get to 8 mana. We're going to see a lot of rampers and a lot of mana dorks in this set. So I think an 8 mana win condition is something viable. I just think that a lot of times you'd rather have a big creature that costs 6 or 7 mana to be your finisher, rather than something a little weird and janky like this. I don't know. I'm giving it a low rating because I think it is slow, and I don't know how the format's going to be yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is actually just a great card. The next card on our list is the enchantment Aura Sixth Sense. It's 1 green for an enchantment. Whenever the creature that's enchanted deals combat damage, you draw a card. A little bit of an awkward card. Initially, it struck my attention that this is probably a good card, and then having reviewed the card a couple times, I think it's actually probably just really poor. If you think about it, you have to put it on a creature that's going to be able to continuously deal combat damage, and that makes it really win more, because you've got a creature that can just hit over and over again without really having anything go up against it. You're probably winning the game anyway. This is best suited on something that has unblockable or flies or something along those lines. And if you're able to get that creature in continuously, you should already be pretty far ahead of the game even without the extra cards. Also, this has to hit a couple times in order for it to even justify its spot in the deck. If you hit a single time with that creature and then that creature dies or the aura is removed, then all you've done is replace Sixth Sense with a different card, which is the whole point of cycling. I'd rather just run a cycler in this spot if that's what I'm trying to do. You have to hit at least 2 times to kind of net even or have any sort of actual card advantage off of this. And I'm not saying that's impossible to set up, but it is asking a lot. Not to mention, this isn't an aura that adds any sort of protection, so having the creature removed also just counts as a 2-for-1, which is where auras like this tend to go wrong. Again, not unplayable, but not a card I'm happy to have in my decks. Especially not a green card. It's just a blue card altogether in the wrong color. Alright, looking at some weak cards. The first one is Manglehorn, and this is actually a strong card when it works and a really weak card when it doesn't. This should probably be a 1, but there are times that you're scrapping for creatures or you just really need another creature in your deck. Maybe something to sling some -1/-1 counters on, and I think Manglehorn does that job fine. It is a 3-mana 2/2 with no upside if you're not destroying an artifact, which is kind of an embarrassing creature, but still trades for a lot of 3-mana 3/2s and things along that line. So not the worst thing in the world, just something you replace if you have better creatures, and then it's actually really good out of the sideboard because you're happy to bring it in against pretty much any artifacts and get a natural 2-for-1 off of it. Spidery Grasp, I'm not a huge fan of expensive combat tricks like this, and this is pretty expensive, but it does give a good enough boost that you could be completely content putting this in your deck. I just don't think I will be. It is worth mentioning there aren't a lot of reach creatures in this set as is. There's maybe 2 that come to mind, and this does give reach, so it's a nice way to take down some of the bomb flyers in this format. It is the type of card that is easy to spot when your opponent leaves mana up and they know that you've got some sort of flying threat, so keep that in mind. It's not a fantastic card, but it's a card you could put in your deck. Probably closer to a 5, just a little bit clunky and expensive, and when it doesn't really do anything, it seems a little bit of a disappointing card that you could just run something else in place of. Benefaction of Ronas is 3 mana for a sorcery that lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library and then choose a creature and or enchantment to put in your hand. The rest do go to the graveyard, which might be relevant for your green embalm creatures, or if you're green-blue or green-white or something along those lines, you might have even more embalm creatures. This could be a 2-for-1, but there aren't a lot of enchantments that you're going to be running. We will see one that's actually really good in green, but even if you get the enchantment, it's still a little bit expensive for this sort of card, and I think you'll miss often enough on the enchantment and only get a creature that you don't really want to play this card and use up a whole turn just to replace it with a different creature. Remember, these card advantage cards in this set seem a little lackluster when you already have cycling cards that fill the same kind of role. Benefaction does let you look at 5 cards and gives you a little bit of selection there, so if you have some gigantic bomb, then that's one thing you could be looking for, but it only nets you a single creature and occasionally a creature and enchantment, so I'm not in love with the card. You could play it all you want. Some people are fans of this more often than others, but I'm usually not a big fan of these cards in Limited. And Haze of Pollen, 2 mana for a fog, prevents all combat damage that would be dealt. Double-sided fog, so you can't really set this up and blow your opponent out. But it also has cycling for 3 mana. Fog's not really an effect you want in your main board very often when it's double-sided, and cycling for 3 is pretty expensive. Put those two things together and you have a card that you could put in your deck, but I'm still not very excited about. Again, green just doesn't have a huge payoff for cycling unless you're paired with black or blue specifically, and fog just isn't a highly impactful card in most games. So I think Haze of Pollen is kind of a weaker card, even though, again, just like Spidery Grasp, if you're a fan of this sort of effect and you want to play it, go ahead, but I don't think it adds a lot to your deck. Alright, a couple archetypal cards, and you'll notice these are more for Manifix. And the first is Gift of Paradise, which is probably weaker than a 4, but when you need it, you're really happy to have it. It's 3 mana for an aura that goes on a land. It enters the battlefield and gives you 3 life, and then that land can tap to add 2 mana of any one color to your mana pool. Keep in mind, this doesn't actually boost you ahead 2 mana, it only ramps you by 1, because that's an alternative ability to just tap in the land for its normal mana. This is fine, it does ramp you, it does gain you a little bit of life, so you can afford to tap out if you're under pressure to play this, and then start casting 5 and 6 drops a little bit earlier. The reason I say this card is archetypal is because you will occasionally want to splash for a gold card or a really strong bomb that may be off color. I do think Amonkhet is geared up to be a 2-color set, and you won't be 3 colors very often unless your draft just isn't going well. But when you are 3 colors, or you do have cards worth splashing, I think Gift of Paradise will be a card you're looking for. And the other reason I say it's archetypal is because there are a lot of 6 and 7 drops and occasionally even 8 drops that you do want to play in this format. And I do think there's a huge payoff for getting them out a turn or 2 early. So I think Gift of Paradise is a pretty sweet way of doing that. Even though I'll admit, if you're not interested in either of those two things, there's no real reason to play this card in your deck. The other one is along the same lines. I hear a lot of people trashing this card, and yes, it's not exciting, but hear me out. Alashra Cultivators, 1 green for an 0/3. For 3 mana, you can tap it and sack it to search up a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. Now, that is a very expensive form of that ability. We actually saw this card in Khans of Tarkir. It was a blue card instead of a green one, but it had the same activated ability, just cost 1 less mana to do it, and that was a fine card. But keep in mind, that was a gold set, so being able to mana fix was much more useful there. I think being able to mana fix here, just like I said with Gift of Paradise, is not negligible. It's something that will come up from time to time. But hear me out on this guy. Oashra Cultivator actually has a nice little role in the green decks, and we haven't seen many of the creatures that make it useful yet. A lot of the creatures in green, at least a lot of the really strong 6s and 7 and 8s that we'll see, require you to put -1/-1 counters on creatures you control. And I've mentioned this in a lot of the other colors so far. That gives a little bit of extra value to your 1-drops, because your 1-drops can bear the burden of those -1/-1 counters, and then suddenly your creatures that grant those counters are coming down as huge threats very early in the game. And then the wonderful part about the Cultivator is you can then sacrifice her, get rid of all those counters like they never existed, and still get a land off of her. So she's a fantastic creature to curve into when you plan on playing a lot of those creatures with -1/-1 counters. So give her a shot. I think she's worth it. I think the same thing as Gift of Paradise. If you ever want to ramp or you want to splash a color, she's a card that you'll be looking for. And if you end up with a bunch of those -1/-1 counter creatures, I think she'll fill her role very nicely. Now, onto cards that are probably a little less controversial. The first one being our playable filler cards here, are cards that I'm never disappointed to have in my deck, but cards that I'm also not clamoring to have in my deck. Colossopede is vanilla 5/5 for 5. I think this card is just fine. If you can ever get it out on turn 4, it should be able to beat pretty hard. It is kind of hard to look at this card and then look at some of the exert creatures that attack for pretty much the same amount of damage a turn or two earlier. But keep in mind, Colossopede is going to be able to untap without exert and attack frequently, and it's in a color that can take advantage of a 5/5 pretty nicely. So nothing really to brag about here, but also nothing really to be upset about if I have to include a Colossopede in my deck. Giant Spider is, in fact, Giant Spider, back again. 4 mana for a 2/4 Reach. Again, Reach is not very prevalent in this set, but this does block those 3/2 and 2/2 flyers very nicely, stopping them from attacking altogether. There are some decks that you play a Giant Spider against, and suddenly they can't attack anymore. So I like Giant Spider. It's just a perfectly normal card, but it is filler, and if your opponent's not playing a flying deck, then, you know, it's just an average vanilla creature. Hapatra's Mark, I like these sorts of effects a little more than I realize other people do. It's 1 green mana to give a creature hexproof, and then if it had any counters on it, you can remove all the -1/-1 counters from it. Obviously, a very nice combo with some of the other creatures we're going to look at here, but I think giving a creature hexproof is worth 1 mana. It essentially counters a removal spell, and does so at a very, very cheap cost. You're only investing 1 green mana. And I believe that there is another green spell that costs 1 mana. When you have multiple instants that have the same mana cost, your opponent often forgets about one or plays around the wrong one, or even a good opponent has to kind of determine which one you might have. And when you have multiple options at the same mana cost, especially 1 mana, you'll find that they set you up pretty nicely to have either effect, and your opponent really has to play around 2 cards when you really only have 1. So I like giving a creature hexproof at instant speed, and if you ever get to remove -1/-1 counters, then this does a very good impression of something like Blossom in Defense or Ranger's Guile if you've ever played with those cards, and I like those cards. I think they're pretty strong. Initiate's Companion is 1 and a green for a 3/1 cat, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may untap target land or creature. I'm sorry, that's not a may ability. You must untap target creature or land. A little bit of an awkward card, right? Because it is a 3/1 in green, and while that is good for 2 mana, there are a few cards that can really destroy your X1s. We have not seen a lot of X1s in this set. So it's not like your opponent should be clamoring for things that kill X1s, but remember, one of the primary ways of removing creatures in this set is through -1/-1 counters, and this thing just straight up dies to a -1/-1 counter. So your opponent can get value off a lot of things that just spread counters around, which makes me believe this card's a little bit weaker than it would be in a normal set. Although, if it ever gets a hidden and you get to untap an exert creature or untap a land and play something above curve, then yeah, it's obviously pretty nice. I don't think I'm cutting this from my deck very often, but I would sideboard it out against certain black decks that are able to just throw counters around. Shed Weakness is very similar to Hapatra's Mark, and this is what I was talking about when I said there were 2 instants with the same exact mana cost, and your opponent has to determine which one they have to play around. This one gives +2/+2 at instant speed, and you can remove a single -1/-1 counter from it, so if you do, you essentially have giant growth, although that effectively becomes close to a +1/+1 counter in a normal set, so the extra power and toughness sticks around if you're removing the counter, and you get the temporary +2/+2. This could be a bit of a blowout. These effects are never fantastic, and this doesn't really give trample, so it is a playable filler card, but I think it gives enough of a boost in combat that your creature will survive most of the time, and you can really make sure your opponent loses whatever combat the creature initiated. Alright, moving on to the cards. This is where things start to get a little bit exciting. The first card here is Trial of Strength. 2 and a green for the green trial. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 4/2. Also, it bounces back to your hand whenever a cartouche enters the battlefield. Now, this is an extra little bonus because I'm just going to go ahead and spoiler alert. The green cartouche is actually really strong, and that makes this card even better than it normally would be. Essentially, you're getting a 3-mana 4/2, which isn't fantastic. I know that sounds like a lot because it has 4 power, but a 2 toughness creature for 3 mana is going to still die to your opponent's 2 and 3 drops. So it's not like it's that much more impressive than a 3/2, but it is still pretty good. And if you are already playing the green cartouche, then you probably want to pick up the trial because they curve nicely into each other, and having the trial bounce back to your hand so you can replay and get an additional beast is just a lot of value. So a lot of trial strength actually lies in you having the cartouche to go along with it, or any cartouche for that matter. And if you ever double trigger this card and play it multiple times throughout the course of a game, it's really good. And if you just don't have any cartouches, it's still a card you're including in your deck most of the time. Watchful Naga is 3 mana for a 2/2, and when it attacks, you may exert it to draw a card. Now, I actually think this card seems like it's pretty good. It's probably a little bit weaker than that. Think about it as a 3 mana 2/2 that just draws a card but doesn't block very well. Obviously, you have to attack with this in order to draw a card off of it, and if you can ever trade this off in combat for an opponent's creature, I think that's pretty good because you're up a card, but your opponent's down a creature. You're down a creature as well, but at least you replace this with a card. And there are a couple situations where you'll be able to draw multiple cards off this. This works really nicely with combat tricks that untap it, which you'll see a lot with some of these exert creatures. I might mention that multiple times coming up here. So I think Watchful Naga is just a good card, but I don't think it's busted or anything along those lines. Hooded Brawler annoyingly looks very similar to Watchful Naga. Apparently the Naga on this plane like to just kind of chill in the rafters or whatever's going on in this art. But this one's 3 mana as well for a 3/2, also with Exert. Very confusing that these cards are similar to each other in a lot of the aesthetics. But when this one attacks, you may exert it to give it +2/+2. So it attacks as a 5/4, and it does so on turn 3, or on turn 4. It comes down on turn 3. This card strikes me as just solid. I think it could go up or down. I don't think a 5/4 is really threatening a lot when you have to leave your defenses open. And I think that's one of the things that people need to realize with Exert instead of overvaluing this. Yes, you're getting a pretty big attacker that's very likely to either just eat up a creature or deal a lot of damage, but oftentimes when you attack with your Exert creatures, you're leaving yourself open, and your opponent gets a lot more out of that if you don't have a backup plan. If you're just exerting every single creature just for an added little bonus and you have nothing left to block, then your opponent's going to be able to deal more damage over the course of 2 turns than you will every time you exert a single creature. So have a backup plan, have some sort of combat trick that untaps your creatures or something along those lines. Otherwise, this card's just fine as a 3 mana 3/2, and if you ever get the added bonus in there and deal extra damage, then I think it justifies its spot as a 6 rather than just a 5. Pouncing Cheetah, vanilla 3 mana 3/2, but flash thrown on top means that you can use this as a removal spell, and when it does so, it often functions as just a 3 mana instant that says give a creature -3/-3, and I think that's pretty good. Well, I guess -0/-3, and I think that's good enough to bump this up from a 5 to a 6. It's not like Flash really makes this that much better unless it's blocking on defense with Flash, but this also leads to a lot of situations where your opponent isn't expecting a creature, they do something not expecting a creature to be able to attack on your next turn, and then you flash this in on end step, and suddenly you have essentially a hasty attacker for your next turn. So I like the Cheetah. Not super impressive, but just a decent card, and it's a cat, which is relevant if you get the Regal Caracal. Sheffet Monitor is 6 mana for a 6/5. When it enters, or I'm sorry, when you cycle it, you may search for a basic land card or a desert card, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. You can cycle this for 3 and a green. I like the versatility of this card, the same as the rest of the uncommon cycle and cycle, which sounds kind of weird to say now that I'm saying it out loud. So if you cycle this, essentially you're casting a 4 mana spell that draws a card and then also gets a land, so it's a nice little 2-for-1 there. And if you happen to not need any land or don't need any deserts, then you can just cast this on turn 6 as a 6/5, which isn't an oppressive creature, but is still a big enough beater that your opponent can't ignore it. So use this either as a 2-for-1 with a little bit of mana ramp, or just use this as a big late game creature to keep bashing, whatever suits your needs. And I believe that justifies it as an uncommon, just a little bit of versatility, which is kind of a broken record by now when it comes to cycling, but that's how cycling cards work. It is worth noting this can get a desert, but I really don't find a lot of the deserts to be that playable anyway. Well, some of them are playable, but just unimpressive. It's not like fetching a desert is a huge boost to this card's rating. Quarry Hauler, another camel creature. I love it. 4 mana for a 4/3, which is already solid, and it's a common, which I just found out today after thinking it was an uncommon for a while. When it enters the battlefield, for each kind of counter on target permanent, put another counter on that kind on it, or remove one from it. So this does a lot of things. It can either take -1/-1 counters away from your creatures. It can put additional -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures. And then there are a couple artifacts that get brick counters and have some pretty cool effects once they get up to 3 brick counters. So if you have one of those artifacts and you're trying to find an easier way to get some brick counters on it, you can play Quarry Hauler as a 4 mana 4/3, which is already a respectable body, and then dump an extra brick counter on top of those cards, essentially cheating their way up to the 3 brick counters they need to be really flashy. I like Quarry Hauler. I think you'll play it almost every single time. Even if it just removes a single -1/-1 counter from a creature you control, I think that's pretty good. Synchronized Strike. I really like this combat trick. 3 mana for an instant. Untap up to 2 target creatures, and they each get +2/+2 until end of turn. This is what you really want to use to, no pun intended, synchronize with your exert creatures. You attack with them, you exert them, and either one of 2 things happens. Either your opponent just doesn't block, and you're able to use this at instant speed on their turn, and you've already exerted your creature, you've already got the bonus, and then you get to untap them, get in a round exert, and give them a boost that's big enough to kind of destroy your opponent in combat, spread across 2 bodies nonetheless. Or scenario B, your opponent does block, you've already exerted, you've already gotten your bonus, and you use this in the middle of combat to save your creatures and still untap them and have them untap to exert again the following turn. I think Synchronized Strike is very strong. It's given 4 power and 4 toughness for 3 mana at instant speed, which is very nice, and it combos with a lot of things in this set, namely the exert creatures. When it comes to pre-release, this is the type of card that blows people out for not knowing the set. So be aware that this card exists, and be aware that this card can just completely destroy you if you don't play around it at certain stages. It is a little bit of a tell if your opponent is just slamming exert creatures in and just aggressively exerting everything, even though it looks like they're not getting a huge bonus off of doing so. They probably have a card like this or some other untapped spell, of which there are quite a few. And final 6 I wanted to include here is Bitterblade Warrior, a 2 mana 2/1 that can exert when it attacks to get +1/+0 and Death Touch until end of turn. So this can attack as a 3/2, and I don't think that's insane or anything like that, but it is good for 2 mana, and it is enough better than just a generic 2 mana 2/2 that you'll just play this card every single time and you'll be pretty happy. Not to mention, once it drops off in the late game and your little 2 mana guy isn't really doing much, or your opponent's just fine taking 3 damage on the attack, then you can dump the -1/-1 counters from other creatures on this and be pretty happy with the results, I think. Alright, moving on to the strong cards, the cards that I'm actively looking for when I start drafting this set. The first one is Cartouche of Strength, probably the best cartouche in the entire cycle. It's 3 mana, enchant a creature you control, and when it enters the battlefield, you may have the enchanted creature fight a creature an opponent controls. Plus, the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 in trample, and yes, that +1/+1 in trample will apply to the creature it's enchanting when the fight happens. So this is very similar to things like Hunt the Weak or prey upon, except you get a permanent +1/+1 in the form of an enchantment rather than a counter, and you also get trample tacked onto that creature if something that trample matters on. This is a really good fight spell, and keep in mind that if this ever bounces a trial back to your hand, even if it's not the green one, you're getting an extra bonus of essentially just drawing a card. So this is a really powerful card, one of green's best removal spells, if not the only removal spell, or at least the only one that's coming to mind. So this is a very high pick. It's just not something I would start the draft off with. I would read it as a tell that green is open if I start seeing this card come around in the earlier portions of the draft though. Exemplar of Strength is 2 mana for a 4/4 that enters the battlefield with 3 -1/-1 counters, or you have to put 3 -1/-1 counters on a target creature you control. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Exemplar of Strength. Whenever it attacks, you may remove a counter from it, or a -1/-1 counter from it, and if you do, you gain a life. So this is coming down as a 2 mana 1/1, but it attacks as a 2/2, gaining you a little bit of life. And if your opponent can't deal with that right away, this card can really spiral out of control. Not to mention if you use one of the enchantments, not enchantments, but if you use one of the instance that removes -1/-1 counters from your creatures, this card just gets out of control very, very quickly. It's also a very nice creature that once it's gotten really big, to dump other -1/-1 counters on, perhaps another Exemplar of Strength, because you do get a bonus for attacking with it, even if you're putting just a small amount of counters. That 1 life isn't completely negligible. It's not the huge upside to this card. The upside is just having a giant 4/4 creature for 2. And this is what I'm talking about when I tell you cards like 1 mana 0/3s are pretty decent, or at least they're more playable than they look like they are, because it sets you up to curve out into just a 2 mana 4/4. If you can ever dump the counters on another creature instead of on the Exemplar itself, you've got a 2 mana 4/4, which is just insane and limited, and is going to be very, very tough for your opponent to beat without losing a couple creatures or getting 3 for 1 or something along those lines. And we're going to kind of see a trend of creatures around this range that do similar things. Ornery Kudu, whatever, is 3 mana for a 3/4. Similar effect, when it enters the battlefield, you put a single -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. So keep in mind, I'm evaluating these cards as they would be if you had to put the counters on themselves, and then giving them an extra little bump up on the rating scale for having the versatility of putting these counters on other creatures as well. The Kudu is essentially a 3 mana 2/3, which you'll see again here in a second, but being able to place that counter on something that matters, or being able to shift it around to something that you're okay losing, makes this a 3 mana 3/4, which should be able to rumble pretty early in the game pretty often, I believe. Very similar along those lines, Defiant Great Maw is 3 mana for a 4/5 that comes in with 2 -1/-1 counters, or if you can toss those counters on another creature, that's great too. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on Defiant Great Maw, you remove a -1/-1 counter from another target creature you control. So this is a very similar creature that actually works in tandem with these other creatures very nicely. Again, just like the Kudu or whatever, this comes down, and if it has to put its counters on itself, it's a 3 mana 2/3, which isn't a terrible creature, so it's not like it completely neuters itself if you can't combo off with it, but it does have an added ability of being able to remove another -1/-1 counter from another creature, while also being a decent place to stick other -1/-1 counters. It is nice how these cards all seem to work with each other pretty well, and I think they are the makings for a pretty good deck, if paired with black, just an insane deck in certain circumstances. Greater Sandworm, moving away from the -1/-1 counter theme for a second, we have a 7 mana 7/7 that cannot be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. That's the quote-unquote Daunt ability, or you can cycle this for 2 mana. Cycling, I said this with some of the blue cards, is really, really nice on very expensive cards, because either you get to the late game and you're okay casting a 7 mana 7/7 with a little bit of evasion, or if you just don't think you're going to get to the late game, or you just need some action a little earlier in the game, cycle it away, draw a new card, see what you get, right? And then if you have any of those cards that return cyclers from your graveyard to your hand, it gets even better. But this is a decent card to curve into, and like I mentioned, there's a good amount of ramp, there's a good amount of mana fixing, so it isn't unlikely that you could get this out on turn 5 or 6 with the right kind of deck, and I think if you do, you have a huge threat in your hand that's going to be really hard for your opponent to deal with. Alright, back to -1/-1 counters. Crocodile of the Crossing is 3 and a green for a 5/4 hasty crocodile, and when it enters the battlefield, you have to put a counter, a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. Assuming the worst case scenario, you have to put this on itself. It's a 4 mana, 4/3 haste creature, which is just very good. In most circumstances, I could never see cutting that card from my deck because of the surprise value. And if you get to put the counter on anything else, I don't know, Defiant Great Maul, something along those lines, something that benefits from having a counter on it, then this comes down as a 5/4 haste, which is even more impressive. It doesn't sound like a huge jump, but being able to crush past those 3-power creatures that your opponent has is a huge, huge boon for the Crocodile. And I think this card's going to play out very well. You can see just from this slide alone the shell of a green deck that cares about -1/-1 counters and how they all interact with each other and take advantage of what's supposed to be a downside and turn it into a positive thing. No pun intended on positive. Naga Vitalist, final card that I'm giving a 7 to. This is 1 and a green for a 1/2 that can tap to add any color to your mana pool that a land you control could produce. So this doesn't fix your colors for you unless you already have those colors available. It can only tap for the colors that you could already naturally tap for, but it is a mana ramp creature. It is a 2-drop. I still very much like Druid of the Cow when it comes to Kaladesh and Aether Revolt, and I think that card is a lot better than people give it credit for. So I think this card, as with a lot of creatures that have the same kinds of ability, is just very good. And you can see, again, from this slide, from everything we've looked at so far, there are creatures and enchantments and spells worth ramping into in this set. A lot of late game things that could really devastate your opponent if you get them down early enough. So play Naga Vitalist every single time. I don't think I would ever cut this card from my deck, and it is the type of card that we've seen shift a little bit in power, or at least as far as people rank it. But as far as I'm concerned, I see this as a sign that green is open, and it's not even the worst if you have to put a -1/-1 counter on this, because it's not really engaging in combat most of the time anyway. Alright, the 8s, really strong cards, getting excited here. Next card on our list is Channeler Initiate, 1 and a green for a 3/4. It enters the battlefield, and you have to put 3 -1/-1 counters on a creature you control. You can tap this to remove a -1/-1 counter from itself to add any color to your mana pool. There's not a lot to hate about this card. Mana dorks aren't really going to engage in combat in the early phases of the game, but the problem with a lot of mana dorks is that they fall off in the late game. They don't stop really being relevant once they've mana ramped, once they've done what you really want them to do. They're just not super relevant in combat, and they end up dying pretty easily or chump walking or something along those lines. The Initiate's really nice because you use it really early in the game to fix your mana, to ramp ahead, to do whatever you need to, and then once you're done and all the counters are removed, you still have a 3/4 behind, which is a completely respectable body when you only paid 2 mana for this guy up front. I would first pick this card every single time. I have very, very strong feeling that there's just no uncommon I'd rather have over a card like this because it just does so much. And there are those situations, just like in the last slide, where you already have a 1-drop, you throw a bunch of counters on that creature, maybe you're happy with it dying, maybe there was some sort of benefit for it dying, and then you just have a 2-mana 3/4 that also is worth dumping your other -1/-1 counters on for additional mana. I don't know, I think the card's super strong here. Prowling Serpapard is 1 and double green for a 4/3 that can't be countered and also stops your other creatures from be countering as long as it's on the battlefield. Not a lot of counter spells, but it is nice that this just completely shuts down Essence. What is it called? You know what I'm talking about. 1 in a blue counter target creature. Essence Scatter. And there are going to be some really feel-bad moments when your opponent's holding up Essence Scatter and then boom, Prowling Serpapard. Go ahead and counter it. See what happens. It doesn't work. I do like this card. It is strong. There are some uncommons I would take over this one. It's not like this guy's a bomb, but it is a very above-curve creature. Just a 3-mana 4/3 is pretty nice, but we see a lot of 3-power creatures at 3 mana as well, so it's not like it's that much better than a 3/3. There are some times that this is going to be great, and it's nice that it has an added little bonus, even if that bonus isn't going to come up that often. It does shut down cards like Cancel, Essence Scatter, Censor, things along those lines that a lot of blue players might be playing in their decks. Champion of Thronas is 3 and a green for a 3/3. When it attacks, you may exert it to put a creature from your hand onto the battlefield. This might be approaching bomb territory depending on how your deck looks. If your deck is just chock full of 6/6s and 7/7s, then yeah, this card's a bomb, but it's only as good as the rest of the creatures in your deck. And a 4 mana 3/3 is often going to just die in combat, so this is the type of creature, the type of exert creature you want to back up with instants and combat tricks. If you can ever untap this and get multiple creatures, then you're in definite bomb territory, but I think it starts out as just a solid creature. And keep in mind, there are some situations where you play this and you just don't have a creature in your hand, and then it starts to look a little bit unimpressive. But there are some situations where this card will be absolutely absurd, and I think that's worth giving it a nod to as just a strong first pick card that I'd be happy to take, while I think the bomb status is a little situational. And then final card I wanted to mention here is actually an uncommon, Scaled Behemoth, 6 mana for a 6/7 hexproof. Solid design here. Hexproof creatures are extremely hard to deal with, and it's really, really nice when you know that your opponent's holding up removal, and you can just put this thing on the battlefield, and suddenly your opponent has to find a different way to deal with a 6/7 creature than their premium removal spell or something along those lines. There are ways to neuter this card. For instance, there's the Gideon's Intervention, which can name Scaled Behemoth and stop it from dealing combat damage, and things along those lines, including edicts and sacrifice effects. But this card is brutal. It's really nice target for the cartouches, since you know for a fact they're going to, or at least if they do resolve, you know they're going to stick on a creature that's very, very hard to interact with. I think this card is just super strong and is borderline bomb territory, but doesn't have trample, doesn't have any other sort of evasion, and can be blocked pretty nicely. It is worth mentioning that white decks are going to be probably positioned pretty fine against these big beaters that don't have trample, since Embalm lets them just have a ton of creatures throughout the course of a game. So this card doesn't win the game automatically, but it's pretty good at defending your side of the field if you need it defended, and also just attacking whenever you know you have a clean attack. Alright, now we're moving into bomb territory. 3 more cards to talk about in this video. The first one I wanted to mention, this eyesore, Vizier of the Menagerie. 4 mana for a 3/4 that lets you look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast creature spells. Notice that's from anywhere. So this fixes your mana completely when it comes to creature spells, which is great. Granted, you're already at 4 mana when you play this thing, so there's that. And it's just a constant stream of card advantage, assuming that you can get creatures on top of your deck. There are times that you'll just have a land on top of your deck, and then this doesn't look like it's doing that much. But it has a respectable body, and even if you cast a single creature off the top of your deck, it's almost like you drew a card. And then the fact that you can potentially do this multiple times, or just get a slew of creatures off the top of your deck without using the cards from your hand, means that you're getting a constant stream of card advantage that your opponent's not going to be able to keep up with. Not to mention it's in green, which is pretty strong. And you get to cycle, or you get to look at the top card of your library, meaning your cycling cards are a little bit more informed. You can decide whether or not it's worth cycling a card at a specific time to know what to dig into the top card of your library. And since you already know what you're getting, you can determine whether or not you need to cycle right away, or if you can hold off, or something along those lines. You'll notice this comes up a lot when you're looking for a land and you're not sure if cycling is worth it because you don't know if you're going to draw a land next turn or off your cycling card. Being able to look at the top card of your library is a nice extra little bit of advantage, or a little bit of information that can inform your decisions a little bit more. But I think the real power in this card is being able to cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card, and just essentially draw a free card and cast it, steeping your opponent in card advantage to the point where they just aren't going to be able to keep up. And 4 mana 3/4 is very solid for this card. So very strong. Mythic Rare won't come up very often, but when it does, it's going to be miserable for the person on the other side. Other bomb I wanted to mention here is Honored Hydra. I do think this is a bomb. It's 6 mana for a 6/6 Trampler, which on its own would be an okay card, but would probably just be a common or maybe a really weak uncommon. But you have a lot of power in Embalm here, and the Embalm cost is ridiculous. 3 and a green to bring this back as another 6/6 trampler. A lot of cool things going on here. First off, if you ever discard this, or you mill through it, or your opponent makes you discard it, or whatever, you have a 4-mana 6/6 available to you from the graveyard. If your opponent deals with this, maybe they had to 2-for-1 themselves, then you just get to cast it again for an even cheaper cost. This is better than a lot of the embalm creatures that you see in the set because their embalm costs are usually more expensive than the initial card. Honored Hydra is just an okay card on its face, but has a cheaper embalm cost, which makes it a very durable threat. Your opponent has to deal with this essentially twice to not die to it, and trample means that they can't just completely ignore it by chump blocking all day long. So I think Hydra is a card I would be very satisfied to pull in my first pack and then do my best to draft a green deck around it. Alright, final card. Obviously there's only one left, but I am glad we're not in Bantu territory, and I am really happy that I can say Ronus the Indomitable, the green god, is just absolutely incredibly insane when it comes to limited. Am I wrong? Is this card not as strong as it looks? This card is ridiculous. It's way better than the rest of the gods. It's just a 5/5 Death Touch Indestructible for 3 mana. Yes, there's a little clause that says it can't attack or block unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater, but let's be real, we're playing green, we're going to have that. And look at the activated ability. If you don't have a creature power 4 or greater, you can pay 3 mana to pump a creature +2/+0 and give it trample for the turn. It is worth noting that Ronus can't target himself with the ability, but being able to spread that ability around gives evasiveness to some of your big creatures, and since you're playing Ronus, you want to be playing big creatures anyway. It is also nice that the green trial makes a 4/2, and that it's not too hard to have 4-power creatures come in. It's also a place that you can put some -1/-1 counters if you need to. It has Death Touch, which is really weird. I have no idea why Ronus has Death Touch. It's not really a relevant ability on a 5/5 Indestructible. If it didn't have Indestructible, I could see that being relevant, but it does have Indestructible, which is just icing on the cake. I think compared to the other gods, this is just absolutely incredible when it comes to limited, and it is very, very strong card. The fact that you only pay 3 mana up front for this card initially is just incredible to me. And when you look side by side at this and all the other gods, and you look at the attack clause and the block clause, it's kind of hard to argue against Ronus being just the straight up best god in limited. Yes, it can be chump blocked, but your other creatures can't be chump blocked. Just super strong. And I'm kind of singing the praises and repeating myself now, but I'll leave you with that. Ronus the Indomitable, in my book, is just a tier 1 bomb in limited, and you will play it every single time. You'll be happy to open it, and your draft will go well. With that being said, we're done with the green here. We will actually look at the real red cards next time, and that'll wrap up the monocolored cards, leaving us with the multicolored, the split cards, or aftermath cards I should call them, and the artifacts and lands from the set. So 3 more videos in this series. I'm hoping you guys will watch the rest of them, and I hope you guys will leave your feedback. If this has been helpful for you or anything else you want me to talk about, please leave some comments so I can read them and see what's up and what's on your mind. With that being said, my name's Timothy, and as always, I'll see y'all next time.